Dear viewers, now I want to try to make a short film that tries to come up with some thoughts that can possibly help soften the frozen conflict between the brotherly people of Russia and Ukraine. What has puzzled me since the Russian military intervention into Ukraine in February 2022 is that it seems that the diplomatic efforts to find a peace solution have been sporadic, and considering the Ukrainian people and the Russians dying on the battlefield, we must try to work out solutions that might soften the conflict and improve relations between the Russian people and the Ukrainian people. We must focus on individual people and their families. A diplomatic path to peace in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has created a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale in Europe. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, thousands have died, and the devastation is extensive. A peaceful solution to the conflict is more urgent than ever. Negotiation is the only way to peace. In order to restore peace and stability in the region, negotiations must be initiated between Ukraine and Russia with the involvement of the major countries, USA, EU, China, Turkey, Germany, France, Great Britain and several of the countries bordering Russia. The negotiations are to take place in Istanbul under the leadership of the UN. Representatives of the Russian and Ukrainian parliaments must also attend to ensure broad support for a possible agreement. There have been several rounds of negotiations, but no agreement has yet been reached on a peace agreement. It is difficult to predict how the war in Ukraine will end. It is possible that the war will continue for a long time until there is a war of attrition leading to a negotiated settlement. It is also possible that Russia will achieve a victory on the battlefield, but that the war will continue as a guerrilla war. Regardless of the outcome of the war, it is clear that it has had a devastating effect on Ukraine and Russia. Many people have been killed or displaced, and both countries are facing major economic and social challenges. However, it must be said that the Russian war economy shows positive trends. The Russian and Ukrainian people have suffered under communism and Nazism in Russia and Ukraine. World War I and the Russian Civil War caused enormous suffering and loss of life in both countries. The communist takeover of Russia leads to a brutal repression of opponents and a famine that kills millions of Ukrainians. Stalin's collectivization of agriculture leads to famine and mass extermination in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. The Nazi takeover of power in Germany leads to the persecution of Jews and other minorities in both Russia and Ukraine. World War II causes unimaginable destruction and loss of life in both countries. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union leads to a brutal occupation regime in Ukraine characterized by massacres, deportations and slave labor. In the post-war period, repression continued in both Russia and Ukraine, and the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 caused widespread suffering and pollution in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 will lead to a new wave of suffering and displacement. In these two countries, millions of people have lost their lives in wars, famines and oppression. The trauma of these disorders lives on for generations. After 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved itself and great progress has been made in both countries, but historically speaking, both the Russian and Ukrainian people have experienced enormous suffering under communism and Nazism. It is important to remember these atrocities and work towards a better future for the Russian and Ukrainian people. The price of freedom, economic and technological growth in Russia and Ukraine after the fall of communism. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia and Ukraine faced an uncertain future. The collapse of communism left a void, both politically and economically. The two countries had to find a new path, a path marked by freedom and market economy. The first years after the fall of communism were characterized by turbulence and uncertainty. But gradually both countries began to experience a period of economic growth. In Russia, it was mainly oil and gas exports that drove growth. Ukraine also experienced positive developments, but at a more moderate pace. Technological development took off in both Russia and Ukraine. The internet became more accessible and new technologies in communication and information technology began to shape societies. However, it is important to remember that the transition to a market economy was not without challenges. Corruption, Lack of institutional capacity and inequality were just some of the problems that both countries had to contend with. The experiences of Russia and Ukraine after the fall of communism were not identical. Russia experienced a more turbulent and uneven development, while Ukraine took steps towards a more stable and democratic path. The future of Russia and Ukraine is uncertain. But one thing is certain: the two countries have proven that they can overcome major challenges and create a better future for their populations. Here are a few positive aspects of the time after the fall of communism: increased freedom and democracy, economic growth, technological progress and openness to the West. The time after the fall of communism was a period of great change and challenges for Russia and Ukraine. But it was also a period of hope and optimism. Both countries have the potential to create a brighter future for their populations. The close trade between Russia and Ukraine. From 1950 to 1991, Russia and Ukraine were part of the Soviet Union. During this period, the two countries were closely integrated into a common economy. There was extensive trade in goods and services, and labor was mobile across borders. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia and Ukraine maintained a close trade relationship. The two countries were each other's largest trading partners, and trade made up a significant part of both countries' GDP. The close trade has had great significance for both Russia and Ukraine. For Russia, Ukraine has been an important consumer of energy and other raw materials. For Ukraine, Russia has been an important supplier of industrial goods and technology. The close trade has created a mutual dependence between Russia and Ukraine. This has contributed to stabilizing relations between the two countries and has made it in the interest of both countries to avoid conflicts. The close trade has also brought some challenges. Russia has tended to dominate the trade relationship, and Ukraine has been concerned about its dependence on Russia. Despite the challenges, the close trade has had a number of positive aspects for both Russia and Ukraine. It has contributed to increasing prosperity in both countries and has created closer cooperation in a number of areas. The future of close trade between Russia and Ukraine is uncertain. The current conflict between the two countries has created a number of challenges for the trade relationship. But it is hoped that the two countries can find a way to resume close trade once the conflict is over. Trade has been of great importance to both countries. It has contributed to increasing prosperity. Historical, cultural and religious ties between Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have a long and complex shared history. Both countries originate from the medieval Kingdom of Kiev, which was a powerful East Slavic state. For centuries, the two countries were part of different empires, including the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Russia and Ukraine share a common Slavic culture, including language, traditions and religion. The two countries have a rich literature, music and art, which is often inspired by shared folklore and history. The dominant religion in both Russia and Ukraine is Orthodox Christianity. The two countries share a common religious tradition, including churches, saints and traditions. There are also strong family ties between Russia and Ukraine. Many families have members in both countries, and there is a long tradition of marriages between Russians and Ukrainians. A large part of the Ukrainian population is also bilingual. According to a 2020 survey by the Ukrainian Statistics Office, 56% of Ukraine's population was bilingual. This corresponds to approximately 24 million people. 43% of the population spoke both Ukrainian and Russian. Many Ukrainians have Russian as their first language. In 2020, there were approximately 29.5% of Ukraine's population who had Russian as their first language. This corresponds to approximately 13 million people. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy for all involved. It has caused unimaginable suffering and destruction, and it has caused a deep rift in relations between Russia and Ukraine. It is to be hoped that the historical, cultural and religious ties between the two countries are so strong that they can also help to bridge the gap and create a peaceful future. It is important to remember that the Russian and Ukrainian peoples have not been enemies. They are brothers and sisters who have a long shared history. They have experienced suffering and joy together, and there is no doubt that both in Russia and Ukraine, They have a common goal of a better future for their children. The war in Ukraine can be won on the battlefield, but peace can only be won at the negotiating table. It is therefore crucial that Russia and Ukraine resume negotiations and find a solution that respects the legitimate security interests of both countries. A peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine is possible. It requires willingness and compromise from both sides, but it is the only way to a lasting peace, and international mediators are necessary, and the first condition is that the parties meet. It is impossible to say who will win on the battlefield, but the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian people is great. The desire for a free and independent country is strong among the population. The country also receives significant support from around 50 economically strong countries, which have pledged to support Ukraine both militarily, humanitarianly, and financially. Before 2014, the population was divided as to whether they should move closer to the EU or still have close trade and cultural relations with Russia. But the annexation of Crimea and the invasion only in 2022 has led to the desire for trade and cooperation being significantly reduced. Thus, today, a very small part of the population in Ukraine wants close cooperation with Russia, regardless of ethnic affiliation. It will take many years to heal these wounds. The war has led to the death of several 100,000 soldiers, and it is estimated that around 10,000 civilians have been killed in the conflict and over 17,000 people have been injured. And several millions are internally displaced in Ukraine. Ukraine's infrastructure has also suffered extensive damage as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war. According to Statista, a worldwide analysis institute, the total war damage in Ukraine is estimated at $135 billion in the period from February 24, 2022 to February 24, 2023. The war has profound consequences for both people and the country's economy. On the human front, loss of life, trauma and IDPs have left a country in mourning. Economically speaking, extensive infrastructure damage and loss of productivity have created a humanitarian crisis. Ukraine is a poor country and Ukraine faces a long and challenging road to recovery. Let us hope that diplomats and the world community as a whole can work together to bring peace and stability to this war-torn country. The security policy situation in Europe and the war in Ukraine. In order to understand the current situation, it can be obvious to go back in history, as it can be of great importance for understanding the conflicts we see today in Europe. During the Second World War, Russia and Ukraine were both part of the Soviet Union, and in the fight against Nazi Germany, they lost an unimaginable number of soldiers and civilians. The Soviet Union lost about 27 million people in the war, including approximately 14 million civilians. The highest number of dead among all the Allied countries. The Soviet Union was also involved in some of the biggest and bloodiest battles of the war. The Soviet Union was the first country to reach Berlin, and it was Soviet soldiers who raised the red flag over the Reichstag building on April 30, 1945. Ukraine, which was one of the most important republics in the Soviet Union, was also badly affected by the war. About 8 million Ukrainians lost their lives in the war, including approximately 5 million civilians. Russia has not felt that the Allies have appreciated their great efforts in the Great Patriotic War, which they also call the Second World War. They also believed that their sacrifices and sufferings in the war were far greater than those of the Western Allies, and that they have not received the recognition and respect they deserve. There is much to suggest that this has been an underlying disturbing element for building good relations between all states in Europe for all these years. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the euphoria that followed, there was a lot of focus from the West on the Eastern countries, and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, these events attracted great interest and attention in the West, for several reasons. The West wanted to support the new democratic movements and processes in the Eastern countries, and offer financial and political help. The West also saw an opportunity to expand European cooperation and security, inviting more Eastern countries to become members of the EU and NATO. The West was also curious to learn more about the previously closed and secretive societies of the Eastern countries. The West was fascinated by the many stories and destinies that came to light after decades of oppression and isolation. The West was concerned about the potential conflicts and crises that could arise in the Eastern countries as a result of the great upheavals. But here we see again that Russia is not in focus. And when they chose to reject Russia's wishes for rapprochement with both the EU and NATO, it was a security, political and commercial misjudgment of resignations. Rejecting Russia's wishes for close cooperation with NATO or joining the military alliance is nothing less than a systemic failure and is the biggest security policy mistake since 1945. There is talk that within the coming years Russia may come up with attacking NATO countries or carrying out military operations into a deserted area in, for example, Finland, to test NATO's defense will and capabilities. It would be illogical if Russia chose to attack a country in the NATO alliance. But if this sophisticated, refined and libelous, even almost condescending language from the political and military elite and the press continues, no one knows what the Russian government will come up with. This is elementary psychology. It would suit NATO and several political leaders and military personnel to tone down the war rhetoric. The people who live in Central Europe want cohesion and cooperation on all fronts with us in Western Europe. If you do not understand that the proud and enlightened Russian people have the same wishes for living standards, travel opportunities and more, and the same wishes for peace and stability as we do, then you are on the wrong track. We cannot dictate the country's form of government. But that is only a sensible path to peace and stability, and that is through close interaction with the Russian people and Russian elected politicians and the Russian cultural and business life. We know what an alternative policy can lead to. Regarding Ukraine, the American political administration was aware early on that the relationship between Russia and Ukraine was a very sensitive issue. The American ambassador's reports from Moscow. In a telegram from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to Washington, D.C. of February 12, 1990, the ambassador, Jack Matlock, warned that a Soviet breakup could lead to a prolonged period of instability and conflict in Europe. He also wrote that Russia could lose control of Ukraine if the Soviet Union collapsed. He said, also loosely translated, that one was that communism had fallen, another was whether Russia and Ukraine became separate. American officials were concerned in 1990 that a Soviet breakup would lead to instability and conflict in Europe. They were also concerned that Russia might lose control of Ukraine if the Soviet Union collapsed. Secretary of State James Baker was also concerned about how Russia would react to Ukraine's independence. He knew that Ukraine was a sensitive issue for the Russians and that they considered it part of their historical and cultural heritage. He therefore asked Gorbachev's advisor Anatoly Chernyaev whether Russia would accept Ukraine's independence or whether it would lead to war. Chernyaev replied, "It's a very difficult question. I don't think Russia will go to war to hold Ukraine, but I can't rule it out. It depends on how Ukraine behaves. If they start suppressing the Russian population, or if they try to leave the common economic space, then it can trigger a conflict." Source: The Russians' Dreams, About the New Russia's Self-Understanding and the West's Misunderstandings, which was published in 2015 by Russian connoisseur Vibeke Sperling. Russia's historical and emotional attachment to Ukraine. Ukraine was close to the Russians' hearts. It was here that the Russian state had been born in the 8th century, and Kiev was known for centuries as the mother of all Russians. For many Russians, Ukraine was part of their identity, and the thought of losing this country was intolerable. It was also here that Orthodox Christianity had taken root in Russia and where many of the most important churches and monasteries were located. Ukraine was also a fertile land that had supplied Russia with grain and other agricultural products. It was a country that Russia had fought to hold on to throughout history, against Poles, Swedes, Turks, Cossacks, and Nazis. It was a country that Russia had sacrificed millions of lives to free from fascism during the Second World War. It was a country that Russia had helped build and modernize under the Soviet Union. It was a country to which Russia had given large parts of its territory as a gesture of brotherhood and friendship. It was a country that Russia had recognized as an independent state in 1991, but with which it still hoped to maintain a close and privileged relationship. Source: Russian Dreams, v. Becker Sperling. The situation of Ukraine today. The security policy situation in the country is unclear. Many countries have provided great aid both militarily and humanitarianly. Several countries have promised extensive security guarantees after the war against Russia is over. In addition, they have entered into agreements on arms aid while the war lasts. Although Ukraine has received massive military aid, the arms deliveries have sometimes been too late and too little military equipment to match the Russian military industry. New arms deliveries are on their way to the country, and it seems that Ukraine's allies will increase their production of ammunition and weapons for the Ukrainian defense. But predicting how things will go on the battlefield is impossible to predict with the limited knowledge I have. The situation in Europe calls for state leaders and foreign services who can think holistically and logically. In diplomacy, we do not need vengeful strategies that basically only aim to weaken Russia and inflict more suffering on the Russian people. Most people also know that economic sanctions are almost useless and that Russia has over 3 billion people to trade with the BRICS countries. Over 40 countries want to join BRICS, and if Argentina, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria and Turkey become members, then there are over 4 billion people in the trade organization. Europe must stand on its own 2 feet. The security political situation requires the NATO countries to upgrade significantly and expand their defense so that they can withstand any threat. In addition, it is necessary to secure an alternative energy infrastructure so that one is not dependent on Russian pipelines. This does not mean that we should not cooperate and buy energy from Russia. All cooperation and trade with Russia can help open up peace negotiations and thus help save thousands of human lives. When Russia says that they feel hugged by unfriendly nations and that they do not want foreign forces so close to their borders, then this is something we must deal with and act from the outside. Therefore, a new security structure in Europe is imperative. Both European geopolitics, minority rights in Europe and trade are all parts that must be in play when trying to get peace negotiations underway between Russia and Ukraine. Possible future peace negotiations in 2024 when you want to try to make a contemporary analysis of the conditions that may have an impact on the situation today and the future security and trade policy for many years to come. So it could be thought that the deep interventions that several so-called NGO organizations carried out in several of the former Soviet republics in the late 80s and first in the 90s could be a contributing factor to the unfortunate situation we have in Europe today. If you think that you can go into other countries and post millions to various democracy movements and equip them with millions of kroner to buy flags and brightly colored t-shirts, then you are naive, if you don't think that it will be noticed in the countries concerned and in Russia. To expect that there will be no response to these activities is naive. No need to trumpet here. Euromaidan demonstrations led to the ouster of President Yanukovych in February 2014, leading to the establishment of a new, pro-European government. Ukraine's secession from the Russian Orthodox Church in January 2021 and the country's rapprochement with the EU and NATO may also be factors that have an impact on the current situation. As mentioned before, it must also be remembered that the way in which Russia's approaches to both the EU and NATO were rejected also has an impact on the geopolitical and trade policy situation we have today. It must be said that it was both undiplomatic, ill-thought-out, frivolous and illogical to reject a wider cooperation with the Russian people only in the 1990s. The conclusion is fairly simple: many countries in the EU and the US wanted to have a monopoly or maintain their power in their trade and defense relations and more. I believe that several of the contemporary problems we face are partly a result of the intransigent policy that was pursued towards Russia in the midst of the great upheavals that the country was going through. The situation today and for many years to come seems to be a strong military build-up both in the USA and other NATO countries and in Russia. This build-up may go beyond the welfare and living standards of millions of people and create even greater uncertainty. There is only a sensible way out of the current situation, and that is for countries such as Germany, France, and Great Britain, together with other nations, to help, with their diplomatic and commercial relations, to show the way and re-establish sensible trade and cooperation relations with the Russian people. In this context, there are great challenges for Germany and the German people to be a guiding star and build a bridge to the Russian people. To say that Germany's large trade with Russia has been a mistake must be due to major misunderstandings. If you think that we will get a more stable Europe by deprioritizing this trade, it must be said to be unimaginably illogical thinking. It must be stated that there is no connection between the trade that has taken place between the countries and Russia's actions today. As I have said before, Germany has never been on the radar as an important nation in terms of defense policy and diplomacy. In the post-war era, many of us have only focused on the United States and Great Britain and looked up to these nations. But the policy and the line that Angela Merkel laid down in the foreign and trade policy towards Russia is of immeasurably great importance to this day and must not be neglected. Of course, together with its allies, Germany must build a sound defense and find alternative energy sources. But this does not mean that Germany and other countries should not buy gas and oil from Russia. It is of vital importance that Germany and other countries help Russia to re-establish Nord Stream 1 and 2 and again enter into sensible energy agreements with Russia. This is for the future relations and trade and interaction of the German and Russian people and to contribute to de-escalation and normalization of conditions in Europe. At the same time, the gas pipeline that runs from Russia through Ukraine must be reopened so that Ukraine also receives foreign currency income this way. Notice, here we are not talking about governments or state leaders, but about people and countries. It is my sincere wish that when a peace agreement is concluded between Russia and Ukraine, that Germany be a beacon and show the way for future cooperation in Europe. It looks gloomy if France and Germany and Great Britain do not get together and help find sensible diplomatic solutions. Poland may also play a significant role in future peace negotiations. Poland is one of Ukraine's close allies. Germany, France, Poland are now reviving the Weimar Triangle, which was formed in 1991 and which, among other things, has defense policy as one of their areas of work. The starting point in the mediation attempts must be based on the fact that Ukraine must not cede land for peace. Elon Musk has stated in mid-February 2024 that it is impossible for Russia to lose the war in Ukraine, but the big question is how can anyone win in this conflict? There has been fighting in Donbass since early 2014, no one has yet won or lost. What is the definition for Russia or Ukraine of winning? We know that Russia has intensified its war industry. We also know that the unity of the allies of Ukraine is strong in Europe, and with the policy pursued, the war can continue for several more years and with thousands more dead civilians and soldiers as a result. Since Russia and Ukraine are neighbors and the parties are getting more and more long-range and sophisticated weapons, it can be predicted that in the coming years they will also send rockets missiles into each other's cities, and on this front the war may also come to a head and back. It is important to note that at the beginning of the conflict several countries probably did not have the necessary knowledge and perhaps not the necessary courage to fully support Ukraine. But if Ukraine's allies say enough is enough, then we have a completely new situation. The situation in Ukraine can also change fundamentally if Ukraine says that the country's airspace is closed and gets the support of its allies to maintain this no-fly zone. Then there is also a completely new situation. With the conflicts around the world, it goes without saying that this war in the middle of Europe cannot continue. The parties must come to the negotiating table and there must also be clear indications so that the parties have an interest in sitting down and negotiating, but this requires international mediation. I must once again point out that there is no question of Ukraine giving up land for peace. The only thing I am trying to point out is that there is no point in isolating the Russian people and you want progress, peace and stability in our part of the world. Before we get into more detail about possible peace negotiations, it is interesting what the Hungarian foreign minister said in connection with his trip to Russia for important negotiations. Peter Szijjártó says cf. Berlingske, the 25th of March 2024. that it is in Hungary's fundamental interest that the war between Russia and Ukraine ends as soon as possible. He wants peace negotiations to begin. According to Hungary's foreign minister, the war brings the nightmare of a third world war closer every day. He has previously said that the war will inevitably end in negotiations, as Ukraine cannot defeat Russia and Russia cannot defeat the entire West. Source: Berlingske, the 25th of March 2024. Kalinka Arman Aga. The well-known Danish journalist Stefan Kretz writes in the recently published book Storm on the way that it is a few business people who own the majority of the business world. On this background, we can well conclude that the USA is not much different from Russia when it comes to ownership of the large companies. One of the biggest problems and probably one of the reasons why it is so difficult to start peace negotiations with Russia is that we do not want to understand that both the Russian business community and the Russian people want trade, cooperation and, by and large, cohesion with us. Russia is an equal business partner on an equal footing with all other countries. The country also has its legitimate security interests, which must be taken into account in future peace negotiations. Three-pronged strategy. I propose to negotiate based on this overall roadmap with a three-pronged strategy, where you have a peace center, where you work with all aspects in relation to future cooperation in Europe and how Russia and Ukraine cooperate in the future and resolve the current conflict. In this forum, all countries who wish to participate can participate. I have proposed that Turkey host these negotiations. In addition, a negotiating body is established where selected countries are involved and where Ukraine and Russia are summoned to negotiations or to submit proposals for further discussion. A format called 15-2. These negotiations are led by the UN. When it comes to a new security structure, these negotiations could advantageously be led by Finland and primarily take place between Russia and Finland EU. Some of the points that must be on the table for future peace negotiations are: reconstruction of Ukraine, financing the reconstruction, mine clearance, no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil in peacetime, protection of Russian language and culture, possible state governments or other delegated form of government in Donbas, economic autonomy, greater control over local resources and tax revenue, political autonomy, establishment of a regional parliament with legislative power, coexistence on the Crimean Peninsula. Any friendly regions in eastern Ukraine such as Russia can also help to rebuild. Lifting of sanctions against Russia and release of frozen funds. Normalization of trade and financial transactions. Both Ukraine and Russia have special wishes if they want to come to the negotiating table. Ukraine will not give up land for peace. Ukraine wants all Russian troops to have left the country before peace negotiations can begin. The country also has a number of completely natural demands for war damage compensation, prisoner exchange and how war crimes should be treated, the reconstruction of the country and more. Russia has a number of general security wishes and special wishes for the Russian minority in Ukraine. Russia wants more autonomy for the eastern regions of the country and especially Donbas. Russia also wants them to be able to maintain their naval base in Crimea, which they have had for well over 200 years. Russia also wants the Russian minority to retain their rights. Since there are over 17% ethnic Russians in the country, it is understandable that the Russian part of the population wants their language to have a natural status in the country, and it is well known that minorities in a country have rights regarding their own language and culture. In the area of security policy, we also know that Russia does not want any more foreign troops marching on its borders. Therefore, they also do not want this to unfold in Ukraine. If we look at the above-mentioned circumstances, then we are talking about completely legitimate and not extensive wishes the countries have for each other. In addition to these conditions, Russia elsewhere in Europe also has a strong desire that foreign forces are not stationed in the former Soviet republics and in Finland or Norway. These are completely legitimate geopolitical interests, and it is very understandable that the Russian people and the Russian government are uneasy about the presence of foreign NATO forces at several of their borders, and that at the same time military exercises may occur at their borders, these countries must cease with hugging the Russian borders. If there is a will for peace and reconciliation, then it should be possible to resolve these differences. It is necessary to start the international mediation as soon as possible. If it is to succeed in moving forward, foreign ministers and their diplomats must begin mediation between the parties. For a long time, I have worked with a format called 15-2, where 15 countries sit down and draw up a peace plan together with Russia and Ukraine. But in order to actually get peace negotiations going, it is my great wish that the foreign ministers from Germany, Great Britain, and France, rather today than tomorrow, will go to Istanbul and, under the leadership of the Turkish president and foreign minister, present drafts to the Russians and Ukrainians for a peace plan, on which they must of course have an influence, but is it also necessary to have peace brokers from outside? At the same time as a peace agreement is being worked on, a trade policy is being drawn up which will get the economy in Europe back into gear. As I see it, an inclusive trade policy is essential for everyone in Europe. The upcoming peace negotiations may take several weeks, and I hope that the foreign services in these countries have the ability and the will to work for peace between the countries, even if this cannot be done within 2 days. But if no one sits down and prepares basic working papers, there will be no progress in the diplomatic field. As I said, the strategy implies that a conciliation institution is established in Istanbul. A peace center in Istanbul IPC 2024 and a center in Finland which will work with a new security structure in Europe. In the conciliation institution, the formalized negotiations take place and only delegates have access. In IPC 2024, the general negotiations take place where all countries and persons who wish to and who can contribute to resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine are welcome. Here we are talking about world leaders, business people and parliamentarians who want to be part of the process of finding a peace solution. In Finland, work is to be done on a new security structure for Europe and where demilitarized probes are introduced at the borders, so that only ordinary border and passport checks are carried out. It will not be allowed to carry out military exercises at each other's borders, and where possible a demilitarized zone of 200 kilometers will be introduced both on land, at sea and in the air. This work must be carried out by Finland. Overall, the conciliation institution must work on the reconstruction of Ukraine, security guarantees for the country, more autonomy for Donbass within the country's borders, rights of Russians in Ukraine language, culture and work and more. The question is also whether some of the eastern oblasts can be responsible for tax collection and have their own state government federalism, and whether national parliament is responsible for foreign and defense policy, environment, human rights etc. on the Crimean Peninsula. They must also agree on a form of government so that in the future there can be coexistence between the Russians and Ukrainians who live there. Could it be imagined that the countries again entered into a leasing agreement for a naval base? Would it be conceivable that the countries could agree that Russia would be allowed to export gas through Ukraine and that Ukraine would also get more income through that? However difficult it may be for the Ukrainian people, I hope they see some possibilities in some of the solutions being produced from many nations, so that they can save lives and keep faith and hope for a proud and free Ukraine. If Russia and Ukraine can agree on the above topics, then it is also necessary to look at what the Russian leaders and the Russian population want in their future relationship with the rest of Europe and the world community as a whole. Russia must also receive far-reaching concessions from the world community, not least geopolitically. This means that no NATO country has foreign NATO troops close to the Russian borders in peacetime. This also implies that in peacetime there must not be foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. Of course, the same conditions also apply to Russia, which must therefore only have ordinary passports and border controls at the borders. When these general conditions are in place, then all sanctions against the Russian leadership, the Russian business community and the Russian business owners must cease. At the same time, all sanctions that have affected the Russian people must end. Russia must again be able to use the SWIFT payment system, and Russia must also release the companies' assets they nationalized during the conflict. At the same time, all Russian frozen assets must be released. The companies that have left Russia because of the conflict must, as far as possible, resume their activity in the country. Normal trade and cooperation relations with the Russian business community and the Russian people must be re-established. In the same way that we will engage in getting the Ukrainian economy back on its feet, in the same way we must also instill in the Russian people hope for brighter times after the countries have concluded a ceasefire and made peace. This is for the benefit of the Russian and Ukrainian people and the world as a whole. Only through trade and cooperation can we create a better world.